So, my friends, this is it. This is the last week in this series. And, from the beginning, the big picture intent for this process has been to lay the groundwork for the future, visioning process of our future building. And in preparing to look to the future, we've sought to better understand a few things. So the first thing that we've sought to better understand is the reality of the church in today's world, in today's culture. The second thing we've sought to better understand is the larger purpose that God has for the church in our world and specifically in our community. And the third thing that we've sought to better understand is really bridging the gap between those two things. How we as individuals and as a church can bridge the gap between this current reality of our church and the culture and the purpose and mission that God calls us to. We've been trying to understand how to bridge that gap as we move forward. And so today, our theme is what's next? Seeking God's preferred future. What's next? What's next? And when we ask what's next, I want you to think of that in a couple different ways. First of all, that's what's the literal very next step? And we're really going to zero in on that today. But beyond the next step, thinking about all that's to come, what's next as we seek God's preferred future for us? Now, I want to go all the way back to week 1 where we started. If you remember, almost 3 months ago, we said that this is a spiritual endeavor. Remember that? It was all the way back, hearkening back to the book of Acts and talking about that what we're doing is a spiritual endeavor, and that if we are to become who God is calling us to be, we need to remember that it's God who transforms. It's God who empowers through the Holy Spirit. And so as a church, first and foremost, we must be Spirit-led. And that means each of us as individuals and as a whole in our leadership here, that first and foremost, God is the one who leads and guides what we do, and that we're intentional in being Spirit-led. And one of the things that I love about today's text is how it begins, how it begins with verses 4 and 5. First of all, it reminds us that Jesus is the cornerstone. That if you think about any building, the most important piece in that building is the keystone, the cornerstone. Jesus is the cornerstone. That whatever it is that God is building us into, both literally and figuratively, what God is building us into, Jesus is that cornerstone. That's the most important piece. But also, beyond that, God is building each of us as living stones into his spiritual temple, that God is building us into something bigger than we can imagine. We've based this series on the book by Reggie McNeil called The Present Future. And one of the things that Reggie says is this: God calls out from the future and wants us to join him there. God calls out from the future and wants us to join him there. Remember, we believe that our God is a God that's not bound by time, that our God sees the beginning and the end and everything in between, right? That our God is not bound by time in the same way that we are. And so this God of ours knows where this is all going. This God of ours sees the whole thing. And so when we talk about God's preferred future, we know that God has hopes and dreams for who we become and how we live this out. And that from that future place, God calls to us, come and join me here. Come live into this future that I have planned for you. Now, as we read the scripture today, we hear that we are living stones that God is building into his spiritual temple. Who's doing the building? God is. God is. All the way back to week 1, Spirit-led. But think about what that text is saying. It's saying that God is the master architect, the master builder. That God has the plans, and God is putting each stone in place just where it goes. But it's God who's doing the building. That's very important for us to always remember and hold on to. But also another piece around this I want you to understand. And this text was written 2,000 years ago. Their technology around building was very different than ours. And a master builder crafted each stone to fit exactly into place. Maybe some of you have been into some of the old cathedrals in Europe. and you see these great arches. And without mortar between stones, you have the capstone, the keystone, holding the whole thing together. Each brick cut, each stone fashioned, molded exactly as it needs to be so that the whole thing turns into something incredible. That's part of this imagery here, that God shapes and molds, cuts each one of us into just the right shape so that together something magnificent is built. That's a pretty cool idea, that God takes the time with each and every one of us to craft and mold us just right. That each stone isn't exactly the same, but each one is made just for its particular part. And that God, having the master plan, having the blueprints, as the architect, puts the whole thing together perfectly. And so God, seeing the blueprints, knowing what the whole thing looks like, calls to us and says, come and join me as we build this thing together. And again, for us right now, we're at a place where that is both literal and figurative, right? I mean, in some sense, we're connecting this with this building that God will be helping us with, that will be a tool for ministry. But way beyond that, it's the way that as a faith community, as a faith family, we are being put together piece by piece to be God's presence in our world in really powerful ways. Now, in this passage, Peter refers to us in some pretty powerful ways. So first of all, in that 5th verse, he says that we are his holy priests. We are his holy priests. Not Pastor Rob's the pastor, but we, all of us, are his holy priests. And he goes on in verse 9 to say, you are a chosen people. You are royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own possession. And as a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for he called you out of the darkness and into his wonderful light. See, we're not just merely passive stones that are waiting in a quarry to be put into place. Okay, that we are stones that are put into this, but we are living stones. And not only are we living stones, but we are priests. You and I are priests. What does that mean? He says that through the mediation of Jesus Christ, you offer spiritual sacrifices that please God. In other words, each of us, you and I, have direct relationship with God. We get to live in connection with God, and we live our lives in a faithful way that honors God. We live our lives in a way that offers faithful sacrifice to God. We are God's holy priests. That's a powerful statement. Have you ever thought of yourself before as a priest of God, a holy priest, a royal priest? So in this text, we get this powerful imagery of we're a living stone. We're part of this much bigger picture that God's building together. And yet also, we're the priests. You are a chosen people, royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own possession. And why? What's the result? As a result, you can show others the goodness of God. Doesn't this speak to what we've been talking about and the whole purpose of the church? I mean, God calls us together. God gives us God's gifts so that we can share them with the world, so that we can tell the world about God's goodness. And we live that out in a lot of ways. Now, interestingly, this also connects in a powerful way to a few weeks ago when we were on Confirmation Sunday, Reformation Sunday. And you remember on Reformation Sunday, I shared with you a few key pieces of our theology. And one of those was the idea of the priesthood of all believers. Okay? An important part of that theology comes out of this text. The priesthood of all believers, that all of us are God's priests, that all of us have direct access to God and live it out. But I want you to hear this. Reggie McNeil, who wrote this book, is actually a Baptist. And I think it's really interesting what he says here right at the end of the book as he's tying this whole thing together. Listen to this. He says, central doctrine for missional renewal is the biblical teaching on the priesthood of all believers. Central Lutheran theology. And then he explains what this means. He says, the people of God, called out and empowered to join him in his redemptive mission in the world. Let me say that again. Central doctrine for missional renewal is the biblical teaching on the priesthood of all believers, which is the people of God called out and empowered to join him in his redemptive mission in the world. That's what we're all about here. That's what this series has been about. That's what we are all about at New Heights, is empowering and equipping all of God's people to live out our faith, directly connecting with God to fulfill God's mission. We are called out and empowered to join with God in God's redemptive mission in the world. Now, I know that's a lot of sort of big churchy words, but there's a powerful invitation here and a call for us to jump in full speed ahead with what God is doing. The priesthood of all believers. This is what we're about. So, as we're talking about this call from God and this future that God has for us, and we ask, what's next? I want to call your attention to the letter that all of our mission partners received in the mail this week. And maybe you've had a chance to read it, maybe you haven't, but I want to lift up a few important pieces in there. So we're asking, how do we partner with God and what God is up to? And first of all, in that letter, we say, we sit at an important crossroads in our ministry together. Before we can move fully into the future God is calling us to, we need to complete the present. We need to complete the present. This is part of the question, what's next? What is the preferred future that God is calling us towards? So what's next? And remember I said when we ask what's next, it's both literally what do we need to do next and looking to what's coming. And you already heard from Annette this morning that we've got visioning sessions coming up. We're going to be voting to begin the formal process with Roberts and Building God's Way. Those are some of the next steps. But we've also got a very concrete next step that we need to do first. As you think about a building, what's the first step in a building that has to happen so that the whole structure is sound and stands strong? The foundation. Right? The foundation has to be stable. The foundation has to be strong. The foundation has to be built correctly. That's our next step, is completing the foundation so that the rest of the building can be built. One more statement from that letter. We are on the cusp of fulfilling a goal we set 5 years ago to become a vital, healthy, and fully funded program-sized church. Now, what does that mean? There's a lot to unpack there, and those of you that were here 5 years ago were a part of the cottage meetings we had when we laid out part of our vision for the future. But this was the reality. 9.5 years ago, when I was called as pastor of this congregation, we were two separate churches, and both churches were really struggling to even keep the doors open. And what we said 5 years ago was, listen, we can either choose to go back to being that size church, or we can choose to move forward into growing into something different. And what we said was, it's okay to choose to go back, but if we go back, what we're choosing is we're recognizing that size church can't survive much longer. That in the world today, a church that's averaging 50 to 60 people in worship on a Sunday isn't going to be able to sustain itself. It's not a viable ministry much longer. So we could either choose that approach, or we could choose to grow into what we are becoming right now. And that is a church that has multiple staff people, that empowers our lay people to step into important roles in ministry, and that ultimately not only do we do powerful things to care for each other, but we're constantly looking out and saying, okay, God, what are you calling us to do in the community? But a lot of things are needed for that foundation to be fully set so that is a viable approach to ministry. And so every year we've been slowly growing, we've been slowly adding pieces, we've gotten grants from the ELCA, we keep adding as we go, and now, as I just said, we are on the cusp of really having that foundation fully set. This is the literal next step, getting that foundation fully set. Well, what is this literal next step? It's what Consecration Sunday is all about. That happens in 2 weeks. It's what Consecration Sunday is all about. We can't be who God is calling us to be unless we are fully making all that happen. And that especially, not only do we need your time and your talents, but we also need your faithful giving. It's your faithful giving that helps us all to come together so that we can live into that future. But first, we have to finish the present. Now, I want to ask you to think about something for a minute. What's the difference between faith and faithfulness? Faith and faithfulness. Here's how I think about it. We live out our faith in faithful living. Our faith is expressed in faithful living. So faith is something you believe, but a belief in and of itself doesn't necessarily accomplish anything, right? Faith is expressed in faithful living, living faithfully. Now, there's another important piece to this, though, because as we seek to live faithfully, something happens with our faith. As we live faithfully, our faith is reinforced and actually grows. Our faith grows as we live faithfully. What am I talking about? As we practice giving our lives away, as we practice volunteering, as we practice stepping up in faith and serving, as we practice how we give to God, our faith is also grown in the process. Now, Consecration Sunday asks us to ask this question. How much of what God has given to me do I feel called to give back to God through the church? How much of what God has given to me do I feel called to give back to God through the church? Now, that's a tricky and tough question, right? And we recognize that everybody is in different places in their lives and in their households. But I want to ask you to think about this in terms of faithful living. How does your giving reflect your faith in this God of ours? How is your giving an act of faithfulness? Now, I've shared with you in the past Anna and I's approach to this. And for us, faithful giving for us is a tithe. A tithe is 10%. We give 10% of our annual income to God through the church. For us, that feels like faithful giving. Now, this is important to understand. That often stretches us. It stretches us. And sometimes we have to make hard choices about what we can and can't do as a family. But when we make our choice about what we're going to give to God, we go through a process. And I hope that you and your household can maybe go through a similar process. We look at our budget. We look at our income. We look at our expenses. We look at our debts. And then we talk about, what is God calling us to give? What for us would be faithful giving? What for us would be faithful giving? Now, in the past, I've shared with you that we tithe, that for us is faithful giving, but also that in the future, we're going to think about going beyond a tithe. We're going to think about that in the future, and I keep saying that. We're going to think about it. Okay, this year, the leadership of this congregation has issued all of us a challenge. The leadership has said, if we all increase our giving by 0.5%, 0.5% of our annual income. Okay, not 10%, not 5%, not 2%, 0.5% of our annual income, we can fully fund this ministry and mission that God is calling to. We can fully do it. So Anna and I had this conversation. Is it time for us to go beyond a tithe? And we're going to do it. This year, we're going to 10.5%. And to us, that feels like faithful giving. Now, what faithful giving for you will probably be different than that. And that's okay. It's not a magic dollar number. It's not a magic percent number, okay? Faithful giving is different for all of us. But what I'm asking you today to consider is, what does feel like faithful giving to you? And is your family in a place where you could increase your giving by 0.5%? And you know what? Maybe you've been blessed in a way that you can go way beyond that. Awesome. And maybe you're at a place right now where you just can't. And you know what? That's okay too. But what does faithful giving look like for you? Here's the thing. When Anna and I look at this and we make this decision for us, it really involves prioritizing. And it helps us prioritize things in such a way that we can keep God at the top of our list, right? I mean, it's really easy to make all of our plans for spending and then give God the leftovers. And what faithful giving really is all about is prioritizing and saying, okay, what feels like giving faithfully to God if faith and God is really a priority for us. We give in the way that we do for a number of reasons, but one of those is that we believe in what God is doing in and through this place. We believe in God's plans for New Heights. We believe and trust that God's work through this place touches and transforms lives. And I know that many of you have experienced that. So I ask you today to think about the ways that you've been growing in your faith in this place. And as you continue to grow in faith, how are you called to grow in your faithfulness? Not just in a dollar figure, but in the way that you live. How are you called to grow in your faithfulness? So what's the next step as we seek God's preferred future? Well, we've got visioning sessions coming. We've got an important congregational vote. We've got other things that are coming down the road. But the literal next step right now is taking care of the present so that we can move into that future. You see, because God is forming us as living stones into God's spiritual temple. And God is working in this place and through us in important ways. And so now's the time for us to fully lay the foundation. It's time. Fully lay the foundation so that we can move into that future that God is calling us to. I want you to hear this scripture as we conclude this morning. And give you a couple minutes to reflect on this. You are a chosen people. You are royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own possession. As a result, you can now show others the goodness of God, for he called you out of the darkness and into his wonderful light.